So let's talk this morning about 3 ways to take risks intelligently. 3 ways to take intelligent risk. Firstly, understand the risk. Understanding the risk. If I was to invest this $100 with, so what's your name? Dave. I invest this $100 with Dave. And in 1 year's time, I get back $150. Was that a good risk? As an investor, I'm very sensitive to risk, as I'm sure each one of you are as well, thinking about it every day. One of the ways that we stack the odds of a successful risk in our favor is by only accepting risk that we adequately understand. This simple, but often difficult to implement idea is critically important because it's the difference between investing and gambling. So the answer to the question as to whether or not my risk with Dave was a good one is it depends. It depends on the level of understanding I possess regarding the details of that specific risk. It's a year later, Dave. I'll take my investment back. Oh, Dave, it's only $100 here. Where's my return? You looked at me like I'm lucky I got it back. Only accepting risk that you understand is critically important. The outcome of my risk, the result of my risk was a very good one. I got 100% of my capital plus a 50% annual return. But this is where people get tripped up oftentimes in determining the quality of a risk. Because in a short term or in isolated events, outcomes, results, can have very little to say about the quality of a risk. I could take a crazy risk, rolling the dice, and it turned out to be wildly profitable. That will almost certainly disguise the fact, but doesn't change the fact that I took a bad risk. What would you do if somebody approached you with an investment opportunity in prairie dog relocation vacuums? These things actually exist. I'm not making this up. Now, you don't know anything about prairie dog relocation vacuums. You're not clear on the economics of the business. You're totally unfamiliar with the competitive aspects of that industry. You haven't done any sort of valuation on the business. But this acquaintance of yours is making 50% a year in these things. Oh, and incidentally, the window to invest closes tomorrow. What do you do with that? Well, in my view, the best answer is you give all your money to your business partner or your spouse, and tell them to lock it up and not to give you the key until after that window is closed. Why? Not because prairie dog relocation vacuums can't be a fabulous business. Not because the returns are too good to be true, so there must be something amiss there. None of that. Only because, solely because, you don't know anything about it. Could it turn out that you'd make 50% a year just like your acquaintance has been making? Absolutely. But even if you did, despite that fact, you would have done so without understanding adequately the risk. Therefore, it would have been an unintelligent one. And unintelligent risks, over time, lead to weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is a rule of gambling, with very few exceptions. And you can substitute the words unintelligent risk for gambling. The longer you play, the greater the house's winnings. This means that you steer clear of wipeout risks. If the potential downside is so bad that you can't live with it, regardless if it's a long shot, you have to say no to that risk. Suppose you were invited to play a game of Russian roulette. 5,000 chamber revolver. 1 bullet. And the payoff for a play was $1 million. How appealing does that game sound to you? A 1 in 5,000 chance of the undesirable outcome taking place. Unless you're on your deathbed, and that payout is substantially greater than the taxable equivalent of your life insurance policy. Playing that sort of game would be crazy. Let's look at the same concept from another angle. Suppose I offer to hire you to come do heavy, hard labor for me and I'm offering to pay you $3 an hour. You laugh at me. You wouldn't even consider it if you thought I was serious at all. What would be happening is you're instantaneously doing a cost-benefit analysis of my proposal. Why don't we apply the same simple but effective reasoning to some risks? Do you ever think about the risk of speeding? Run in numbers and you'll see, and I'm sure you know this intuitively, that the benefit that accrues to the speeder is trivial at best, particularly if there are stoplights involved in your route. The average person in the average commute will receive a 4-minute, thereabouts, time savings benefit, while risking about an average $80 ticket, and perhaps much, much worse. It's not a good risk. It's irrational. So in closing, as I begin to wrap things up, let me paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt. The risk-taker's place shall never be with those cold, poor, and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. But I need to temper Mr. Roosevelt's observations, and I'll do that with the observations from another notable thinker that perhaps you appreciate as well, the late actor Chris Farley. The intelligent risk-taker's place shall never be with the foolish risk-taker's place, which ultimately is in a van down by the river. Risk is inherent in succeeding, but that doesn't mean that you have to be risky. There's two types of risk: unwise and intelligent. Let's recap the latter very briefly. Intelligent risk is characterized firstly, and most importantly, by you understanding the risk. Begin to understand the risk. Begin to prove to yourself that you adequately understand the risk by thinking through it on paper. Can you identify what are the key things that are going to make it win? More importantly, what are the key things that will make it lose? In fairness, though, it should be said that even if we only accept risks that we sufficiently do understand, still some are not going to work out. Nevertheless, you should prefer wise losses over dumb gains. You should prefer wise losses over dumb gains. Why? Because generally neither will be repeated. Insist on only accepting risks that you comfortably comprehend as number one. Secondly, intelligent risk we talked about is characterized by right timing. Right timing happens to be a derivative of the first point. It's very difficult to identify good timing, or more importantly, bad timing, of a risk that you don't sufficiently understand. Right timing requires emotional fortitude. Don't get caught in the trap of always feeling like you have to do something. This is particularly important for people in our profession. Masterful inactivity is a big part of successful risk-taking. If something is overpriced, be willing to wait. The same exact risk at two different times could be a terrific one or a terrible one. Could you imagine if that young lieutenant couldn't wait for the tunnel? Number three, intelligent risk is characterized by having a sober view of the gain-loss potential of a risk. Having a sober view of the gain and the loss, the benefit and the cost relationship of the risk. In order to begin to assess the risk, you have to have some level of clarity on both the severity and the likelihood of the possible unwanted outcome. Because every risk contains a possible unwanted outcome. And if that outcome is potentially so severe that you couldn't live with it, regardless of how highly improbable it is, you have to say no to that risk.